A San Antonio man known as the suitcase killer died by lethal injection tonight. Rosendo Rodriguez III was executed for the 2005 murder of a 29-year-old Lubbock woman. He raped and beat her before stuffing her body into a suitcase and tossing it in the trash. He also confessed to killing a 16-year-old girl in a similar manner. Rodriguez's execution is the 7th nationally this year.
She was folded inside a suitcase. She may have still been alive when he closed it. He was a United States Marine. He trained in martial arts combat on behalf of his country. He was trusted with the defense of the nation. He came from a family that believed he could one day become president. He had no prior criminal record. Not a single one. No arrests, no charges, no warning flags in any official record that would have told anyone, his family, his commanding officers, the women who would cross his path in Lubbock, Texas, that Rosendo Rodriguez III was dangerous. He raped and murdered a pregnant woman, folded her body into a suitcase, threw her away like trash. And then he did it again. And when Texas came to execute him for it, he fought back with everything he had. Rosendo Rodriguez III was born on March 26, 1980, in San Antonio, Texas. He grew up in a household that had its problems. His father was described in court testimony as alcoholic and abusive, but Rosendo appeared from the outside to be the kind of person who had overcome that. He was good-looking, charming, personable, the kind of man who walked into a room and made people feel comfortable. He had enrolled at Texas Tech University. His family, during his trial, would describe him as a young man of enormous potential. They said he could have become president. That is the word they used. President. A young man with the intelligence, the discipline, the presence to go all the way. He joined the United States Marine Corps Reserve. He trained in martial arts combat, the kind of hand-to-hand training the military uses to prepare soldiers for the most physically demanding confrontations imaginable. He was skilled. He had purpose. He had no prior criminal convictions, not a single one. No arrests, no charges, no warning flags in any official record that would have told anyone, his family, his commanding officers, the women who would cross his path, that Rosendo Rodriguez was dangerous. That invisibility was part of what made him so dangerous. Because behind that face, behind the uniform, the charm, the potential, the clean record, something else was happening. 5 women would eventually come forward and testify that Rosendo Rodriguez had raped or sexually assaulted them. 5 women. His high school girlfriend was among them. These were not strangers making accusations. These were people who had known him, trusted him, been alone with him. None of those assaults had ever been prosecuted. None of those women had ever been believed, or had been in a position to make anyone listen. The record stayed clean, the face stayed charming, and Rosendo Rodriguez kept going. In September of 2005, he was sent to Lubbock, Texas for Marine Reserve training. He checked into a hotel, and on the night of September 11, 2005, he encountered a 29-year-old woman named Summer Baldwin. She would never leave Lubbock alive. Summer Baldwin was 29 years old. She was a native of Washington State who had found herself in Lubbock, Texas, a long way from home in more ways than one. She was a mother of 4 children. She was working as a sex worker in Lubbock to survive. She had served jail time there for a drug conviction. Her life had not been easy or forgiving. She was also, at the time of her death, serving as a witness in a federal counterfeiting case. That fact brought the FBI into what would otherwise have been a local homicide investigation. It meant her disappearance carried additional weight in ways that even Summer Baldwin herself may not have fully understood. And she was 10 weeks pregnant. Summer Baldwin was not a woman the world was designed to protect. She occupied the margins, the spaces where women disappear and the machinery of concern moves slowly, if at all. She was vulnerable in the specific ways that made her a target. And Rosendo Rodriguez, with his training and his charm and his practiced ability to read people, knew exactly who she was when he found her. On the night of September 11, 2005, Summer Baldwin went to Rodriguez's hotel room. What happened inside that room would become the central legal battleground of a case that would not reach a courtroom for 3 more years. What is not in dispute is what was found 2 days later. On September 13, 2005, workers at the Lubbock City landfill were moving through their routine when one of them noticed something that didn't belong. A new suitcase, brand new by the look of it, sitting in the trash. They opened it. Summer Baldwin was inside, naked, folded. Her body had approximately 50 blunt force wounds. She had been beaten with a severity that, according to the medical examiner's testimony, was consistent with sustained, deliberate violence. Not a momentary loss of control, not an accident, deliberate. She had been strangled, and the medical examiner's finding, the finding that would become the most contested piece of evidence in this entire case, was that the injuries on her body were consistent with sexual assault. Severe sexual assault, the kind that requires force. She was 10 weeks pregnant. Her unborn child died with her. Investigators immediately began working the suitcase. Someone had purchased it recently, specifically to put a body in it. This was not a crime of opportunity with whatever was available. This was planned. Someone had gone to a store, bought a new piece of luggage, and brought it back to dispose of a woman. The suitcase had a UPC barcode label sewn into the lining. Investigators ran it. The suitcase was a model sold exclusively at Walmart. They contacted the nearest Walmart. They pulled the purchase records for that specific suitcase model in the hours before the body was discovered. The records showed one transaction for that model in the relevant window. The buyer had used a debit card. The receipt had a name on it. Investigators pulled the store surveillance footage. There he was, on camera. Rosendo Rodriguez III, purchasing the suitcase. He had also bought latex gloves at the same time. He was in Lubbock for Marine Reserve training that included martial arts combat. He had stayed at a hotel nearby. Detectives went to that hotel room. Inside, they found the suitcase tag, the one that matched the luggage Summer's body had been folded into. They found a used condom. They found blood spatter that matched Summer Baldwin's DNA. They found latex gloves with DNA from both Rodriguez and Summer Baldwin on them. Rodriguez had already returned to San Antonio. Detectives drove there. They arrested him at his parents' home. He did not resist. He had been in Lubbock for training. He had bought a suitcase. He had bought gloves. He had left every piece of himself at the scene, and he still thought he could explain it. 3 weeks after his arrest, Rosendo Rodriguez gave a statement to Lubbock police. He had a story. He told it calmly, clearly, with the kind of composure that comes from either innocence or from a specific kind of coldness. He said Summer Baldwin had come to his hotel room willingly, that they had consensual sex, that afterward he confronted her about her drug use, that she became angry, that she lunged at him with knives, that he defended himself, that he put her in a chokehold, the way he had been trained, that it was an accident, that he panicked, that he didn't know what to do. He said he checked her pulse, that she had none, that he went out and bought a suitcase and gloves and disposed of her body because he panicked, not because he had planned it, not because he was calculating, because he was scared. The medical examiner's findings told a different story. 50 blunt force wounds, injuries consistent with her thighs being forcibly held apart, damage to her vagina, cervix, and anus consistent with violent sexual assault, strangulation. The medical examiner testified that all of these injuries occurred shortly before or at the time of death, not after, not from a trash compactor at the landfill, before. Defense attorneys would later suggest that the blunt force injuries could have been caused by the garbage truck that compacted the trash at the landfill. The medical examiner testified that he had specifically distinguished the pre-death wounds from the post-death injuries that occurred during transport. The pre-death wounds were extensive, deliberate, and sufficient on their own to cause death. The medical examiner also testified that Summer Baldwin may have still been alive, just barely, when she was folded into that suitcase, that she would have died shortly thereafter from positional asphyxiation, unable to breathe, unable to move, folded into darkness. She may have been alive when he closed the lid. Rodriguez's story of self-defense collapsed against the physical evidence. But it was the finding of sexual assault, specifically that finding, that changed everything about what charge he would face. Under Texas law, murder committed in the course of sexual assault is capital murder. It is the difference between a life sentence and a death sentence. That medical examiner's finding would become the fulcrum on which his entire fight against execution would eventually balance. While investigators were building their case against Rodriguez for the murder of Summer Baldwin, they began pulling threads from his past. Phone records, online chat logs, digital footprints. The threads led somewhere they had not expected. Joanna Rogers was 16 years old. She had been missing from Lubbock for more than a year before Summer Baldwin was found. Her family had reported her gone. Investigators had looked. She had not been found. Records showed that Rodriguez had been in contact with Joanna Rogers online before her disappearance. Chat logs, phone records, evidence that placed him in her orbit in the period before she vanished. Prosecutors approached Rodriguez with a deal: plead guilty to both murders, Summer Baldwin and Joanna Rogers, in exchange for life in prison. No death penalty. Life, with the possibility of eventually dying behind bars without a needle in his arm. Rodriguez accepted. He confessed to killing Joanna Rogers. He told investigators he had met her in an online chat room, that she had come to him, that she had become violent when he refused to pay her for sex, that he had wrapped his hands around her neck and choked her, that he had put her body in a suitcase and thrown her away in a landfill, the same landfill where Summer Baldwin would later be found. Based on his confession, investigators mounted an extensive search of the Lubbock City landfill. They found Joanna Rogers, mummified, inside a suitcase, exactly where he said she would be. Then Rodriguez went to the courthouse to finalize the plea deal, and at the last moment, with his attorneys, the judge, and the prosecutors all present, he backed out. He claimed he could not understand what his attorney was telling him. He refused to sign. The confession to Rogers' murder had already been given, but because the plea deal had fallen apart, prosecutors could not use it at trial. What they could do, and what they immediately chose to do, was seek the death penalty for the murder of Summer Baldwin. He had just confessed to killing a 16-year-old girl. He had led them to her body, and then he walked away from the deal that would have saved his life. Lubbock County District Attorney Matt Powell did not hesitate. Rodriguez had handed them the decision. He was going to trial for his life. Rosendo Rodriguez went to trial in March 2008, nearly 3 years after Summer Baldwin's body was found in that landfill. The evidence against him was, by almost any measure, overwhelming. The Walmart surveillance footage, the debit card records, the suitcase tag found in his hotel room, the blood spatter, the used condom, the latex gloves carrying both his DNA and Summer Baldwin's, his own confession, given freely, voluntarily, in detail, placing himself at the scene and describing, in his own words, how she died. His defense team contested the sexual assault finding. They argued the sex was consensual. They raised the trash compactor theory for the blunt force injuries. They presented evidence of his abusive, alcoholic father, attempting to show the jury a man shaped by a difficult environment, not a calculating predator. His family took the stand during the punishment phase. They told the jury about the man they loved, about the potential they had watched him carry his whole life, about the young man who could have become president. Then the other witnesses took the stand. 5 women, his high school girlfriend among them. Each one testified that Rosendo Rodriguez had raped or sexually assaulted her. These were not strangers. These were women who had known him, been alone with him, and been violated by him. None of these assaults had ever been prosecuted. None of these women had ever gotten justice. But now they were in a courtroom, under oath, looking at the jury and describing what he had done. During the punishment phase, Rodriguez made his confession to the murder of Joanna Rogers on the record. He described it with the same calm detachment he had brought to his police statement. He had met her online. She had raised her voice at him. He had choked her. He had put her in a suitcase. He had thrown her away. On April 1, 2008, Rosendo Rodriguez III was found guilty of 2 counts of capital murder. Rodriguez arrived on Texas death row in 2008. He was 28 years old. He had, barring a successful appeal, the rest of his life ahead of him in a small cell in Livingston, Texas. He became a writer. He contributed regularly to a death row inmate blog called Minutes Before 6, a platform that gave condemned prisoners a voice on matters of criminal justice, policy, and politics. His writing was intelligent, articulate, and pointed. He wrote about the death penalty with the authority of someone living inside it. He engaged with legal arguments. He thought carefully about his situation. He also maintained with increasing specificity that the system that had convicted him was not as clean as it appeared, that the medical examiner whose testimony had elevated his charge from murder to capital murder, making him eligible for the needle, was not reliable, that the district attorney who had prosecuted him had something to hide. His attorneys were listening. And in 2015, something happened in Lubbock County that would change the shape of Rodriguez's final appeals entirely. A former employee of the Lubbock County Medical Examiner's Office filed a whistleblower lawsuit. The lawsuit alleged something specific and damaging, that the chief medical examiner, Dr. Sridhar Natarajan, the same man who had performed Summer Baldwin's autopsy and testified about the sexual assault findings that made Rodriguez eligible for death, had a habit of leaving the office to tend to his own private medical practice, that he regularly delegated autopsies to unqualified staff members, that he then signed off on those autopsies as if he had performed them himself. The lawsuit alleged that in some cases, Natarajan had not performed his own claimed autopsies at all. The autopsy that sent Rosendo Rodriguez to death row had been performed by Sridhar Natarajan. Or had it? Rodriguez's attorney Seth Kretzer argued that the whistleblower lawsuit, which had been settled by Lubbock County for $230,000, was never disclosed to the defense, that it constituted a Brady violation, a failure by the prosecution to hand over evidence that could have affected the outcome of the trial, that the jury had never been given the opportunity to consider whether the man who told them Summer Baldwin had been sexually assaulted had actually examined the body himself. Kretzer said it plainly. At minimum, they should be allowed to depose Natarajan and find out whether he had actually performed the autopsy or not. Courts were not persuaded. The settlement included a statement that there was no reason to question the scientific validity of the medical examiner's office findings. Lubbock County District Attorney Matt Powell maintained that there was no Brady information in the suit that related specifically to Rodriguez's case. The appeals were denied, one by one, state court, federal court, each door closing in the same way doors close in these cases, procedurally, quietly, permanently. In February 2018, 1 month before his scheduled execution date, Rodriguez's legal team made their final push. They filed for a stay of execution, arguing that the whistleblower lawsuit against Natarajan and the questions it raised about his autopsy practices had never been properly evaluated in federal court, that no federal judge had ever looked at the substance of whether the testimony that sent Rosendo Rodriguez to death row was reliable. This was not a claim of innocence. Rodriguez had confessed to killing Summer Baldwin. He had led police to Joanna Rogers' body. He had told investigators exactly what he did and how he did it. The claim was narrower and more precise, that the specific finding of sexual assault, the finding that made this a capital case rather than a regular murder case, rested on the testimony of a medical examiner whose credibility had been directly and specifically challenged, and that challenge had never been heard in federal court. If the sexual assault finding was unreliable, then the charge itself was unreliable. And if the charge was unreliable, then the death sentence was built on a foundation that had never been fully tested. The state of Texas disagreed. Assistant Attorney General Tomi Heining called the appeals improper, untimely, and meritless. She called it nothing more than a last-ditch effort. Rodriguez had confessed. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The appeals should be denied. On March 27, 2018, 1 day after Rosendo Rodriguez's 38th birthday, the state of Texas prepared to carry out his sentence. His attorneys made one final move. They appealed directly to the United States Supreme Court. Less than 30 minutes before Rodriguez was scheduled to be taken to the death chamber, Justice Samuel Alito denied the stay of execution. The full court, without comment, rejected the appeal. Every door, every court, every argument, every last option, all of them closed, in less than 30 minutes. At 6 o'clock in the evening on March 27, 2018, Rosendo Rodriguez III was taken to the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He was 38 years old. He had turned 38 the day before. In the room beyond the glass, 2 sets of eyes were watching. On one side, Rosendo Rodriguez's family. On the other side, Joe Bill Rogers, the father of Joanna Rogers. Uva Robach, the mother of Summer Baldwin. Two families who had been waiting for this night. Two families who had buried their daughters, or tried to, or were still trying to. Two families for whom no courtroom outcome, no execution date, no legal proceeding had ever touched the actual weight of what they had lost. The warden asked Rodriguez if he had a final statement. He did. He spoke for 7 minutes. He never apologized. Not once, in 7 minutes, to the parents of the women he had murdered watching through the glass, did Rosendo Rodriguez III say he was sorry. Instead, he called for an investigation into Lubbock County District Attorney Matt Powell and medical examiner Sridhar Natarajan, claiming they had been involved in multiple wrongful convictions. He called for a boycott of Texas businesses until the state ended the death penalty. He repeated the arguments his attorneys had made in the appeals courts, the arguments every court had rejected. He addressed the warden directly. He said the state might have his body, but it would never have his soul. He said he had fought the good fight. He had run the good race. He had accomplished what God intended him to do. He said he was ready to join his father. At 6:24 in the evening, the lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered. 22 minutes later, at 6:46 p.m., Rosendo Rodriguez III was pronounced dead. He was the 7th person executed in the United States in 2018. He was the 4th in Texas that year. Joe Bill Rogers, Joanna's father, had sat through 7 minutes of a man who had murdered his 16-year-old daughter talking about himself, his fight, his soul, his God, and never once acknowledging that Joanna Rogers had existed. After it was over, he said an apology from Rodriguez would not have made a bit of difference. He said Rodriguez just cared about himself, just a sociopath. Summer Baldwin's mother, Uva Roback, said Rodriguez had gone to his maker and gotten his justice now. Both families walked out of that room carrying exactly what they had walked in with. Their daughters were still gone. The weight of that had not lifted. It never does. The Rosendo Rodriguez III case is not a case that leaves much room for ambiguity about guilt. He confessed, twice, to 2 murders. He led police to Joanna Rogers' body. He was on surveillance camera buying the suitcase and the gloves. His DNA was on those gloves. His blood spatter was in that hotel room. His own words, given voluntarily, described what he did. This is not a case where an innocent man may have been executed. The evidence does not support that reading. But the case raises a different question, one that is less dramatic and more systemic, and for that reason more durable. What happens when the specific piece of evidence that elevates a crime from murder to capital murder, from a life sentence to a death sentence, is testimony from a medical examiner whose credibility was later called into direct, specific, documented question? What happens when that challenge surfaces after the trial, after the appeals, after every procedural deadline has passed? And what happens when the courts, correctly, under the rules they are bound by, say that it is too late to look at it? Rodriguez killed Summer Baldwin. He killed Joanna Rogers. He was guilty of murder. That is not the question. The question is whether the specific charge of capital murder, the charge that required a finding of sexual assault, rested on testimony that should have been scrutinized more carefully than it was. Whether a jury that had been told about a whistleblower lawsuit alleging that the medical examiner delegated autopsies to unqualified staff would have found the same facts. Whether the system caught everything it needed to catch, or whether in its procedural march toward finality, it left something unexamined. Rodriguez chose to fight. He wrote about it on a prison blog. He raised legal arguments from inside a cell. He found attorneys who believed the medical examiner question was worth pursuing. He appealed to every court available to him, and every court, state, federal, supreme, told him, too late. He was not the first to fight that way. He will not be the last. Summer Baldwin was 29 years old. She was a mother of 4 children, who lost their mother in a landfill on the outskirts of Lubbock, Texas. She had been trying to survive. She was a witness in a federal case. She was 10 weeks pregnant. She begged for none of this. She chose none of it. She was violated and discarded, literally thrown away, by a man who by every measure the world uses should have been the last person anyone would have worried about. Joanna Rogers was 16 years old. She had been missing for more than a year before anyone found her. She had spent that year folded inside a suitcase in the same landfill where Rodriguez would later put Summer Baldwin. Her father, Joe Bill Rogers, flew to Huntsville to watch the man who killed his daughter die. He said afterward that it was done, and they were fortunate. Fortunate. That is the word he used. Not at peace. Fortunate that it was done. Because for families like his, for families like Summer Baldwin's, there is no outcome that gives the word done its full meaning. The execution happened. The needle went in. The clock stopped at 6:46 p.m. on March 27, 2018. Summer Baldwin and Joanna Rogers are still gone. And Rosendo Rodriguez III, the Marine, the charmer, the man with no prior record, the man who bought a suitcase and gloves at Walmart and threw 2 women away, spoke for 7 minutes at the end of his life and never once said their names. He fought against his own execution. He lost. The Rosendo Rodriguez case is the kind of case that forces you to hold 2 things at once: a man who was unquestionably guilty of terrible things, and a legal question about the specific charge, the specific evidence, the specific medical examiner that the system decided it did not have time to fully answer before the execution went forward. Whether you believe those 2 things can coexist, whether a guilty man can simultaneously be owed a fuller examination of the evidence that determined his punishment, is a question this case has never cleanly resolved. And it will keep asking it long after Huntsville, long after 2018, long after every appeals court has moved on to the next docket. That is the kind of question Dark Case File True Crime was built to sit with, not to resolve neatly, not to give you an easy answer, but to make sure the full story gets told: the crime, the victims, the evidence, the fight, and the questions that remain. If you are not already part of this community, subscribe to Dark Case File True Crime right now. Hit subscribe. These stories don't wait. Every case we cover completely. No shortcuts, no sensationalism, just the full story. From the crime scene to the courtroom to the execution chamber, and every question that survives all of it. If this video moved you, like it, share it. The more people who see this, the more stories we can tell, the more voices we can give to the ones who were thrown away and forgotten. Like, subscribe, share. Dark Case File, True Crime.